Hello everyone, so during this video we'll be working on the dragon that I named Ignis, and we'll be actually finishing this armature doll project off fully and giving him a full set of clay, as well as talking about, well, how dragons could be scientifically actually possible. And well, some of the answers might surprise you more than you think, so stay tuned to find out.
Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well, and thank you for tuning into Moose Motion. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed the content, comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new, and be sure you have your post notifications turned on so you don't miss any of the new content. Anyway, thank you for your support, it's highly appreciated.
So during this video, obviously we're going to be finishing off this project, which is, well, been named Ignis the Dragon, and well, for those of you who don't speak Latin, Ignis is basically a Latin word for fire or burn. And well, the reason that I said give him a Latin name is because I'm a bit of a dinosaur dork and figured it would be kind of cool to associate, well, dinosaurs and dragons kind of together, and well, oddly enough, there is kind of some fun facts that kind of do correlate to that, but we'll discuss those later on here. Now, taking a slightly different approach to, well, obviously kind of my other scientifically accurate content involving dinosaurs, where more or less that stuff is kind of based off science. And don't get me wrong, technically all the facts that I've gathered for how dragons could possibly exist is also scientifically accurate, but we're obviously talking about mythological creatures here, so there's gotta be, well, some, well, room for speculation, or, yeah, controversy, I guess it would be another word for it, because obviously it's not a real monster, and some people might think that they do, but yeah. Obviously, science kind of probably disagrees with you. However, there has been things in the past that kind of, well, explain it to a degree too. So during the video, obviously you'll be watching me make a dragon, and if, well, for those of you who actually want to make your own, there's plenty of text for you to follow along. However, we'll obviously be explaining more of the scientific aspect of things during the commentary. So we'll be answering questions like, did something like dragons actually ever exist? What could have dragons evolved from? And could a creature actually ever produce fire? And obviously more. Now, before we get into the discussion whether or not dragons could be scientifically possible, we should probably discuss what are dragons and what makes them a dragon. Now, the most basic description of a dragon is a reptile-like creature that is capable of flight, and in some cultures, not all, is capable of breathing fire. And this basic description of dragons can be broken down even further into, well, different various types. Basically, there's about 3 different categories for dragons. Number 1 being tetrapod dragons. Dragons having basically 4 limbs, 2 as wings and 2 as legs, or also commonly known as wyverns or cockatrices. Number 2 being hexapodal dragons, which happens to be the type that we're building here. They're dragons that possess 6 limbs, 2 of which being wings and 4 of which being legs. And the third dragon being serpentine dragons. Basically, dragons that possess no wings, are serpent-like shape, and can still fly either using magic and or wind. And these dragons are generally seen in Asian cultures like China and various other things like that. I know Chinese generally have the big, well, whole New Year's thing with different various animals, dragon being one of them. Now, the description can be broken down even further to dragons with scales and with dragons with, well, like feathers or hairs. So all in all, there are 4 different types of dragons: wyverns, cockatrices, hexapodal dragons, and serpentine dragons. So now that we have a brief understanding of what different types of dragons there are, we'll go into the realms of science of which ones will be actually plausible and or functional. So in order for a dragon to be scientifically plausible, it needs to basically fall under this category, where it can essentially speculatively evolve from a species that already currently exists or once did exist. So the species of dragon that, well, fits this description, well, quite easily as a matter of fact, is known as the cockatrice. They're categorized as small feathered dragons with membranous-like wings. Wings evolved from skin membranes like bats that basically have, well, fine skin stretched out between their fingers. And 2 legs. Some depictions of the cockatrice basically have a rooster-like head possessing a beak, while others have a snake-like head possessing teeth. Now, cockatrices are basically the most scientifically plausible dragon because basically we found a creature that actually fits description quite well. Or a dinosaur known as Yi Chi, and the name translates to strange wing in Mandarin. It's a small dinosaur no bigger than a crow found about 7 years ago. Yi Chi evolved from a dinosaur lineage known as the Scandariopteryx. God, that's a hard name to say. Apart from these dinosaurs having extremely difficult names to pronounce, they were very bird-like and did possess feathers, and like birds, they did evolve flight. But unlike birds, they didn't exactly evolve that trait by any normal means. Instead of using feathers to power flight, they basically developed a skin membrane much like a bat wing. Now, without getting into too much of the technicalities of explaining what the wing looks like, essentially it looks very similar to a modern-day fruit bat. One thing that should also be mentioned is Yi-Chi did not actually have the capabilities of powered flight. It was more thought to be an actual glider. Essentially, it would be flying from tree to tree. However, this description does actually fit the cockatrice quite well, because they're not exactly known for their capabilities of powered flight, given that they're mostly depicted on the ground. However, Yi-Chi probably did spend most of its life in the trees because it would have been far too vulnerable otherwise, being a very small dinosaur, so it probably spent a lot of its time clinging onto trunks and branches and gliding from tree to tree. Realistically, the only thing that might vary from the appearance of a cockatrice to a Yi-Chi is essentially the Yi-Chi actually has a small amount of teeth. However, the feather orientation on Yi-Chi does actually strongly suggest that it would have been more posed like a beak, so it would have been a beak with teeth. So really not that far off. Other than that, cockatrice and Yi-Chi are pretty much a perfect illustration of each other. So all in all, basically, scientifically speaking, a cockatrice is actually pretty much explained by Yi-Chi. Therefore, is by far the most scientifically accurate and, well, plausible dragon out of this entire list. Now on to wyverns. They're described as scaly reptilian dragons with 2 legs and 2 wings, similar to a cockatrice but possessing scales instead of feathers, and a much less bird-like head. These dragons are probably the most common depiction in pop culture, such as Smaug in The Hobbit and/or the dragons from Game of Thrones. These dragons are basically big cockatrices that lack feathers, and possess scales and have very similar wings. One would think pterosaurs would be a good lineage for this type of dragon to actually exist. However, there are a few different things that don't exactly line up. Basically, the member-like wings on dragons are used with more than one finger in between the member sheets, and well, pterosaurs have essentially one large finger attaching that member sheet, so that doesn't exactly fit the description very well. To add to this, pterosaurs also don't have scales, and have more like a hair-like pycnofiber. So that brings us back to, well, Yi-Chi being the most likely candidate for evolution for the wyvern. However, there are quite a few major problems with this candidate. One being that, well, Yi-Chi possessed feathers, and it also wasn't exactly a reptile. Being more of a bird, it probably had more of a warm-blooded metabolism. So a scientifically plausible wyvern essentially wouldn't be a reptile. It would only have the appearance of one. Now, the other big problem would be, pun intended, is the overall size, because, well, wyverns are complected as very large animals in comparison to Yi-Chi, which is the size of a crow. Not to mention, there's also the problem of powered flight, where obviously wyverns are capable of flying around, Yi-Chi was only capable of gliding. Therefore, wyverns are nowhere near as possible as, say, a cockatrice. However, there is kind of, well, some reasoning that they could possibly exist to a degree, as long as Yi-Chi took some rather drastic evolutionary turns. Their wings would need to be much broader, and, well, their muscles attached to those wings would need to be much stronger. Not to mention, it would need to obviously probably switch its diet if it were in order to get much larger. Unfortunately, it's most likely it would probably get no larger than a fruit bat. Now there's the matter of the scales as well. Now there's only one circumstance that I can really think of that I could see a, well, bird-like creature essentially turning all of its feathers into scales. Where birds do possess a small amount of scales known as avian scales, generally on their feet, so essentially every single one of those feathers would have to turn into one of the avian scales. These avian scales are basically feathers that have evolved to form kind of a scale-like structure over time by condensing and hardening. And Yi-Chi did actually possess these on its feet. However, it is basically impossible for an organism to turn every single one of those, well, feathers into these types of feathers, without having prior traces to, obviously, prior generations of evolutions. So the conclusion on wyverns is they are scientifically plausible, however, highly unlikely. Now onto the third dragon, the hexapodal dragons, which is a dragon that possesses 6 limbs and or more sometimes. Now I'm going to keep the description on this one very brief. because, well, just let's be honest, not possible. In order for a hexapodal dragon to actually ever evolve, essentially the entire evolutionary branch of, well, life as we know it for invertebrates would have to change. Invertebrates being species of animals with backbones. Basically, we invertebrates, well, there's no such thing as 6 limbs. There would have to be, like, at the very beginning, there would have to be some drastic changes, and basically every single animal that has ever lived would have to have 6 limbs, and at some point, a reptile would have to decide that those other limbs were useful for legs. So, to sum this up very briefly, because I don't really have time to get into the entire scientific discussion of this dragon, unfortunately, given that I am kind of running out of time at this point, it's just not possible and would basically have to be genetically engineered for it to be even slightly feasible. So, moving on. Now, on to Serpentine dragons. They are very snake-like dragons that lack wings, and often fully covered in scales and have 4 limbs, and usually have fins on their backs and sides. These dragons are often depicted in Asian cultures. They either fly by magic and or the wind. Now that's the first thing science needs to explain here. How can one fly without wings? Now obviously that seems kind of impossible, but oddly enough science actually does have an explanation, and personally I had my doubts about this dragon being scientifically accurate at all. And well, doing some research for this video, I kind of realized how wrong I really was. Because of Chrysalopela, the gliding snake. Chrysalopela is a genus of snake that lives in southeastern Asia. Now, being a snake, it obviously fits the description of a serpentine dragon quite well, apart from the fact that this thing doesn't have limbs. However, Chrysalopela actually has the capability of gliding without wings, and honestly, if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend checking it out, and I will see if I can provide some links in the description of some footage of this snake flying around, because god is it cool, but kind of creepy. The secret lies in the snake's shape, however, because the snake's body shape completely changes after jumping from tree to tree. The stomach muscles, rib cage, and internal organs completely change their shapes and flatten out to almost disc-like or ribbon-like shapes. This enables the snake to basically, well, catch the wind without actually having wings and able to glide. The snake is able to do this basically because it's adapted special stomach muscles. This enables to basically squish itself so it can, well, glide. Therefore, the Chrysalopea is probably the most likely candidate for the Serpentine dragon, mainly because, well, vast majority of these snakes generally inhabit the same countries that these types of dragons actually also inhabit. And honestly, I kind of think that these snakes are probably the reason that these mythical dragons have been originated in the first place. And it's honestly pretty easy to see why. So in my speculative scenario, in which a serpentine dragon exists, it would have to evolve from these gliding snakes. So Chrysalopela would have to basically start eating larger and larger prey, therefore it can grow much larger. As the Chrysalopea moves up the food chain, it would probably have to make more adaptations towards flight, probably having more fin adaptations, making it easier for the snake/dragon to glide or fly further distances, and possibly giving it more, well, steering capabilities or maneuverable capabilities in the air. So basically, serpentine dragons would have to evolve from this snake and basically adapt into larger sizes, growing various different fans and fins to basically assist with its gliding capabilities. However, the dragon is most likely not to have any limbs, given the fact that its lineage would come from a snake. Although snakes technically do have tiny limbs, but that's a discussion for another time. Now that we've gone over the fact that some of these mythical dragons' body designs can be explained through science and nature, it's time to move on to, well, probably the most admirable trait about dragons, the fire breathing. So the big question here is a reptile able, or any sort of living organism for that matter, able to basically produce fire. First, what are the requirements for fire? So there are 3 main necessities a person needs to basically use in order to create fire: oxygen, heat, and fuel. Now, oxygen can be easily accounted for given the fact that we live on the planet Earth and, well, our atmosphere is full of it. And, well, fuel source can be oddly explained easily enough given the fact that basically every living organism actually produces flammable gases, generally in the form of, well, or scientifically known as hydrogen or methane. Now, technically, these gases can be used as fuel. Now, generally, our bodies just gets rid of this gas by, well, passing wind. Now, it is possible an organism could store these gases in a bladder of some sorts to basically use it for later, then using a diaphragm of some sorts to essentially force these gases out through the mouth. Now, the last thing we need for this concoction at this point is, well, heat. Now, obviously, the spark would have to come from outside of the dragon's body, so a hypothetical dragon would have to eat some sort of mineral to produce this spark. However, luckily, there is one mineral in particular that could actually help produce that spark, known as a piezoelectric crystal. So basically, a dragon would have to eat this crystal, have some sort of muscular pouch inside its mouth to store it in, and well, flex it, igniting the gas coming out of the chambers. So there you have it. Technically, a organism is capable of breathing fire. However, given that methane generally comes out the backside, I kind of like the image of, well, a fire-farting butt dragon. That sounds like a future project that's a terrible idea, but kind of fun at the same time. Any rate, this project took over 3 weeks to make this little clay dragon by hand, so I would appreciate if you leave a like, because I got a feeling the algorithm is going to punish me for taking so long. Comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new. Any rate, that's enough from me. Till next time, take it easy.